Welcome to one of the most secret chapters of World War II, where voices, not weapons, turned the tide of battle, where a language once banned in American schools became the very key to victory. August 7th, 1942. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. Engines roared beneath the low clouds, the jungle steaming with heat and gasoline fumes. The sea glowed with the first light of invasion, and somewhere between the black smoke and the palms, a code no enemy could break was about to change the war. The landing craft shuddered as its steel frame scraped coral. Marines crouched low, rifles, tight hearts pounding to the rhythm of the propellers. Orders crackled through static, broken jammed, half lost in the chaos of surf and artillery. But one voice, calm and unfamiliar to most ears, spoke through the radio, Atsa Tikin Nez. 3 words in Navajo. 3 words that carried the position of enemy guns before the shells even landed. On the beaches, men choked on smoke and seawater. The jungle erupted, machine guns, mortars shouting in a dozen accents. Commanders demanded clarity, speed, precision. But every second mattered, every syllable could decide a life. Standard English codes took hours to decrypt. The Japanese had already cracked some. Yet here on this forgotten island, messages in a language born of desert mesas and red rock traveled faster than any cipher wheel. The air trembled with the hum of generators and fear. A radio man wiped mud from his eyes, listening to words he didn't understand, but trusted with his life. Across the line, another Navajo answered his signal, bouncing between ship and shore, unbroken, pure. The code carried through gunfire and static, a sound no enemy linguist could trace. By the time night fell, the enemy lines were blind. American units had repositioned, reinforced, survived because of a voice they couldn't translate. A sound that rose from centuries of oral tradition into the noise of modern war. Smoke in the lungs, steel vibrating, the air thick with heat and secrecy. And then a single order cuts through the noise. This is when Navajo code talkers changed the course of the Guadalcanal campaign. Before we begin, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening. Maybe it's late at night. Maybe you're on the road. Feel the pulse of history with us, and remember the voices that once spoke freedom into chaos. Before the static and the smoke, before the humid jungles of Guadalcanal, the story began in the arid mesas of the American Southwest, among the red canyons and endless horizons of Arizona and New Mexico. The Navajo people had carried a language older than the Republic itself, complex, tonal, unbroken by written script. For centuries, it survived through memory, through rhythm, through breath. No alphabet, no cipher wheel, only sound. In 1942, as the Pacific burned and the Allies searched for a way to communicate faster and safer than the enemy could intercept, a Marine officer named Philip Johnston stepped forward. Johnston wasn't Navajo. He was the son of a missionary raised on the reservation, one of the few outsiders fluent in the language. He remembered how during his youth, the government schools had punished Navajo children for speaking their tongue. Now that same language might save thousands of lives. The concept was daring to use an indigenous language unwritten and unknown to most of the world as the basis for a secret code. The military brass were skeptical, but the Japanese had already broken several Allied encryption systems. Ciphers that took hours to send and decode were costing soldiers lives. They needed speed and something the enemy couldn't possibly anticipate. In a small test at Camp Elliott near San Diego, a handful of Navajo recruits demonstrated what seemed impossible. Using their language to describe military terms, turtle for tank, chicken hawk for dive bomber, ironfish for submarine. They transmitted a message that took ordinary operators over an hour to encode and decode in under 20 seconds. The officers in the tent stared at one another. The experiment worked. Soon the Marine Corps authorized a pilot program, 29 Navajo men recruited and trained under absolute secrecy. They built a code built within the code, a vocabulary of 200 words to begin with, expanded to more than 600 by war's end. For the first time in American military history, an indigenous language became a strategic weapon. But these young men were not soldiers by nature. Many had never seen the ocean. They came from sheep ranches, trading posts, and mission schools, fluent in both Navajo and English, yet belonging fully to neither world. Boot camp was a shock, the shouting, the uniforms, the shaving of hair that once symbolized identity. Still, they endured. The Marine instructors noticed something: their focus, their quiet discipline, their memory sharper than most. In less than 8 weeks, they were not only Marines, but cryptographers, communicators, and living encryption machines. By late 1942, as the first major American offensive in the Pacific prepared to strike Guadalcanal, the code talkers were attached to the 1st Marine Division. The plan was risky. The Japanese occupied the island, its jungles thick, its supply routes treacherous. The Marines believed the enemy was stronger, more entrenched, better prepared. What they didn't know was that timing and communication would flip the map. When the first wave landed on August 7th, the code talkers went ashore carrying radios and their memories. No notebooks, no written key, just language and instinct. Every position report, every artillery request, every status message ran through them. Within minutes, they proved faster and more secure than any field cipher the Marines had ever used. In one early encounter, as Japanese artillery began pounding the beachhead, a Navajo operator relayed coordinates so quickly that Marine batteries adjusted fire in real time, saving dozens of men. Officers who once doubted the experiment now depended on it. They learned to trust those quiet voices over the static voices carrying centuries of resilience now weaponized for survival. The enemy couldn't break what they couldn't even hear properly. To Japanese cryptographers, the words were meaningless bursts of sound, not numbers, not letters, not patterns. The code was alive, breathing, shifting, and entirely human. By September, Guadalcanal's battle lines had changed. What began as a desperate foothold turned into a steady advance. Supplies flowed. Commands were clear. Confusion lessened. The Marines, who once thought themselves outmatched, realized they had something the enemy didn't: a secret network powered not by machines, but by memory, rhythm, and trust. And in that fragile chain of words, from one island to another, from one radio to another, the balance of the Pacific War began to tilt. They believed the enemy was stronger. But language, timing, and the courage of 29 young men from the mesas of the Southwest flipped the map. They arrived at Camp Pendleton under gray California skies, men barely out of school, wrapped in thin desert jackets, eyes adjusting to the humidity of the coast. The Navajo recruits were quiet, but their silence wasn't hesitation. It was calculation. They listened before they spoke, studied before they acted. Drill sergeants mistook it for shyness at first, but in time they learned the rhythm of these men was different, slower to spark, but impossible to extinguish. Their training began the same as any Marine wake at 0430 run, until lungs burned, memorize weapons parts, until the smell of gun oil became familiar as home. But layered beneath the standard regimen was something no manual could teach: the building of a living code. In barracks lit by a single bulb, they spoke words the instructors couldn't comprehend. They shaped a language born of wind and prayer into sharp, tactical clarity. They failed often in those first weeks. A word mistranslated, a signal misheard, a missed beat in transmission that could have meant disaster in battle. Each mistake carried weight. They practiced until every syllable had precision, until the pauses themselves became part of the rhythm. At the start, only 29 men. By the end of that summer, a few more joined the first generation of code talkers. They drilled on SCR 300 radios, each weighing nearly 40 pounds. The radios overheated, the cords tangled, the vacuum tubes cracked under stress. But they learned to repair them on the spot, soldering connections in the dark, whispering messages into microphones no larger than a fist. The Marine instructors tested their limits. They sent messages between hills 10 miles apart, through wind, through rain, through interference. English messages took an average of 2.5 minutes to encode and deliver. The Navajo code, even at that early stage, averaged 20 seconds. Accuracy 99.8%. The brass watched in disbelief. Still, the men were reminded daily of where they stood in the country that had called them wards, not citizens. Some of the instructors mocked the unfamiliar tones of their speech. Others simply didn't understand what these young men represented. But inside their own circle, they built something unbreakable, a trust that no ridicule could touch. During training, one of the recruits, Chester Nez, wrote later that he remembered the contradictions clearly. "We were forbidden to speak Navajo in school. Now the Marines said, speak it fast, lives depend on it." That paradox fueled them. What had once been shame was now strength. Discipline hardened into instinct. They ran communication drills while carrying full gear 20 miles across desert terrain, conserving fuel, conserving words. Each learned not only how to transmit, but how to move, when to crawl under fire, when to shield the radio, when to stay silent. The standard Marine radio unit required at least 2 operators, one to send, one to guard. But the code talkers often worked alone, trusting that their voice, their code, was protection enough. Every day had a rhythm: dawn PT, weapons practice, field code, drills, endurance marches. The Marine Corps measured progress in cold statistics: fuel consumption, supply, delivery, survival rate. But among the code talkers, progress was measured in trust. The more they learned, the more the crew around them began to listen, to wait for their signal before acting. By late 1942, the first operational unit was declared combat ready. Each code talker memorized 600 terms, everything from tank turtle to fighter plane hummingbird. They had to adapt instantly. New code words were added weekly. The rules were simple: never write the code down, never share it beyond the circle, never break the rhythm. At night, when the camp fell quiet, they practiced by whispering into the dark, relaying coordinates from one tent to another, timing themselves, testing accuracy. It became second nature, Navajo words translating into English, meaning then back again into motion, a chain of thought turned into survival. Failures still came, messages lost to interference batteries dying mid-sentence. They learned to measure distance by signal delay, to judge terrain by echo. One recruit said later, "We learned to listen not only to the words, but to the silence between them." By now, the Marine Corps had begun expanding the project. Training quotas rose. Requests for more Navajo operators flooded in. They realized that every battalion in the Pacific would soon need at least one code talker unit. The 1st Marine Division received its first set: 4 men, 1 per company. Small numbers, but exponential impact. Fuel and ammunition were rationed tightly in those months. The Marines calculated every gallon of gas as if it were gold, 12 gallons a day per radio truck, if the weather held. Each transmission had to justify the fuel, the battery, the risk. Yet the Navajo messages traveled light: voice, air, electricity, nothing wasted. The war was still young. Many of these men hadn't fired a weapon in anger yet. But the radio sets had become extensions of their bodies, heavy, humming, alive. When the first orders came for deployment to the Solomon Islands, there was little ceremony. Just a handshake, a nod, a pack slung over the shoulder. They had been forged by failure and discipline, by the repetition of sound and silence. They weren't just radio men anymore. They were memory itself, encoded in motion, ready to enter a battle where one missed word could shift the tide of history. Soon their voices would rise over the jungle canopy, not in song, not in prayer, but in code. And when they spoke, the Pacific would listen. Guadalcanal, August 1942. The first American offensive in the Pacific. A place few could find on a map, now soaked in heat, fear, and expectation. The jungle smelled of salt smoke and something metallic like blood left too long in the sun. The 1st Marine Division landed at dawn. The water was waist deep, the surf breaking hard against coral reefs. Packs weighed over 70 pounds, rifles nearly useless once drenched. From the tree line came no sound. Then suddenly, all sound at once. Rifle bursts, mortar fire, shouts in Japanese. The jungle came alive. Radio operators hit the beach behind the first wave. The code talkers moved with precision, one hand gripping the radio set, the other steadying the antenna. Their voices cut through the chaos like wires through fog. Dibe to Atsa. 3 words. Coordinates translated into the language of the desert. Within 30 seconds, artillery shells screamed over their heads, detonating deep in the jungle where enemy fire had begun. To the untrained ear, it sounded like poetry, rhythmic, musical, almost ancient. But every syllable carried deathly precision: grid squares, troop numbers, directions of fire. By the second day, communication lines were stretched thin. Heavy rain turned trails into rivers. The humidity destroyed field maps. Yet the code talkers' transmissions held. Their average message time, 18 seconds. Standard encryption systems still took 2-3 minutes, and the Japanese were listening. Enemy intercept units on nearby islands recorded hours of Navajo transmissions. They called it ghost language. To them, it was nonsense. The sounds didn't match any known dialect in the Pacific. Japanese cryptographers filed reports describing the code as a human noise without logic. The Marines at Henderson Field didn't care what the enemy thought. only that the messages worked. Ammunition resupply was falling behind. Rations were running low. The division's supply losses reached 15% in the first week. The Japanese controlled the air by day and shelled the perimeter by night. In that chaos, the Navajo voices became the only thing moving faster than the battle itself. A young code talker named Joe Hosteen called in coordinates for air support during the Tanaru River skirmish. The Japanese had crossed the shallows under moonlight, silent as the tide. Hosteen's transmission, 15 seconds long, turned the tide. Marine mortars locked onto the riverbank. Within minutes, the crossing became a slaughter. Commanders credited the new code boys with saving an entire flank. But the cost of communication was always weight literal and moral. The SCR-300 radios consumed precious energy and battery life. The Marines rationed every amp hour as carefully as water. The terrain killed machines faster than bullets, moisture corroded circuits, mud jammed antenna joints, salt air fried components. Yet somehow the Navajo sets always found a way to hum. They worked in pairs, though rarely together. One near the command tent, another near the front line, linked only by signal and trust. Their radio discipline was perfect. Short bursts, no repetition, no wasted breath. If a message failed, they didn't panic. They recalibrated, rewired, retried. The rhythm of war became the rhythm of the code. By mid-September, the Japanese counterattacked along the Matanakaw River. Torrential rain pounded the coast. Trees shattered under shellfire. The Marines fought blind in the storm. Reports came in fragmented, broken words, lost coordinates. Only the Navajo signals stayed clear. Enemy advancing from East Ridge. Request fire grid Fox 7. Copy Fox 7 confirmed. Adjust 10 yards south. Fire. Minutes later, the ridge exploded in light. The enemy advance stalled. A single correction in Navajo saved over 100 men trapped along the line. Commanders began referring to the code talkers not by name, but by call sign, their voices as reliable as the rifles on the line. In official after-action reports, phrases like radio section efficiency exceptional and signal time reduction 82% appeared again and again. Yet the men themselves remained invisible. They ate in silence, slept near the radios, often working 20-hour days. When asked how they endured, one replied simply, "Because we could speak." The jungle took its toll. Malaria, exhaustion, and fear claimed as many as bullets. But the language, their weapon, never broke. It wasn't written down, couldn't be stolen, couldn't be copied. It lived in them. And as long as they breathed, the code survived. One night, during a Japanese bombardment, a shell landed near the signal tent. The blast blew the radio apart, shattered the antenna, sent shrapnel through the sandbags. The code talker crawled through the wreckage, patched the line with torn copper wire, and resumed transmitting blood on the microphone smoke in his throat. The message went through. The artillery adjusted. The enemy guns fell silent within minutes. When dawn came, the field was quiet again. The Marines held the ridge. Their supply ships finally broke through the blockade. For the first time, Guadalcanal was theirs to keep. Commanders credited better logistics. Analysts pointed to timing and weather. But in the foxholes, the men knew it was the code. The voices that carried across miles of jungle unbroken by static or fear. The island had been a graveyard of plans. The maps meant little here, rivers, shifted paths vanished overnight. Yet through it all, the invisible web of Navajo words held the battle together. Every order, every counterattack, every retreat was strung along syllables passed mouth to mouth, mind to mind. When the last shots faded and the jungle fell to silence, those voices lingered. They had turned an island of chaos into a signal of hope. For the first time in a war built on machines and metal, victory had come through the oldest tool of all human speech. And somewhere in the smoke, a radio man whispered in Navajo, "To ei ina, water is life." The static replied. And for a moment, even the war seemed to listen. By October 1942, Guadalcanal had become an island of ghosts. The rain never stopped, and the smell of rot clung to everything. Uniforms, rifles, even the letters tucked into pockets that would never be opened again. The jungle hummed with insects and the low moan of far-off artillery. Every man there understood that survival came down to seconds and sound. The Japanese were preparing a night assault along the Lunga perimeter. Intelligence had warned of a concentrated push, thousands of men moving under cover of darkness. The Marines were exhausted, half-starved, their supply lines hanging by a thread. Communications would decide everything. Inside a dugout beneath Henderson Field, two code talkers crouched beside their radio, the flicker of a single lamp dancing on their faces. The first private first class, John Benally, adjusted the frequency with mud-stained fingers. The second Corporal Charlie Begay checked the antenna line, whispering the code phrases under his breath like prayer. They had been awake for 27 hours. At 2300 hours, the ground began to tremble. The Japanese artillery opened fire. Shells whistled overhead, exploding in white bursts that lit the palm trees like lightning. The radio hissed power surge, silence, then static. "Lines cut," Begay muttered. Benally grabbed the spare spool, crawled out into the open, the rain hammering his helmet. The jungle was burning, the air thick with dust and flame. He spliced the cable by hand, fingers bleeding where the copper bit skin. He didn't look up when the next round landed 30 yards away, just finished. The joint sealed it with a strip of wax paper and shouted, "Try again!" The radio came alive. On the other end, Major Turnbull's voice cracked through. "We've lost the East Ridge. I need coordinates for counter-battery now." Begay's reply came instantly, calm, deliberate, precise, atsa, tse, chish. 3 words, Eagle Rock Wood, code for fire mission coordinates. Artillery units responded within seconds. Shells arced overhead, disappearing into the night. The first volley hit dead center. Then another. The Japanese advance slowed, then faltered. The ridge lost only minutes before was held again. But in the exchange, shrapnel tore through the dugout. The lamp shattered. The air filled with smoke and dust. Benally fell silent. Begay turned, his partner lay motionless beside the radio headset. Still in place, the copper line coiled around his arm like a vein. He didn't have time to stop. The radio was still humming. More coordinates came in, more calls for support. Begay swallowed hard, retuned the dial, and kept speaking. His voice didn't shake. Not once. Hours later, when the firing finally ceased, dawn broke pale and gray over Henderson Field. The jungle steamed like a furnace. The ridge was intact. Hundreds of Marines were still alive because 2 voices had refused to break. In his field log that morning, an artillery officer wrote a simple line. "Signal relay, Navajo operators, continuous transmission under fire. Estimated saved 2 platoons. Loss 1. There was no name, no detail. Just the record, factual, unadorned. But for the code talkers, it became an unspoken prayer. Each man carried someone's silence with him after that. Weeks passed. The Japanese retreated deeper into the jungle, their supply lines severed, their morale fading. Yet victory came slowly, painfully, at the cost of every inch. The code talkers continued their work messages sent between regiments, airfields, and ships at sea. They were ghosts moving through the static, their language a bridge no enemy could cross. In late October, as the battle for Henderson Field reached its peak, the radios once again became lifelines. Batteries died, wires snapped, and still the Navajo signals persisted. One operator scrawled a note inside his helmet with a stub of pencil. "Battery low, don't stop, we're the last link." The final Japanese assault came under the cover of a thunderstorm. Lightning split the sky, artillery thundered back. It was chaos, perfect for confusion, perfect for error. And yet, in the middle of the storm, the Navajo voices kept their rhythm short, exact, unwavering. "Dibe to yaji, hastiin klesh nilchi." Orders, coordinates, confirmation, each carrying life and death across the airwaves. When the smoke cleared, the Marines still held the field. The Japanese line broke for the last time. Guadalcanal, once an island of desperation, had become a foothold, the first real Allied victory in the Pacific. That night, Begay sat beside the repaired radio, its casing, dented wires, twisted antenna patched with melted solder. He wrote in his field notebook, "Benally spoke the code faster than the wind. He said the words before I could think them." The line held because he didn't stop. He closed the notebook and tucked it into his pack. Years later, historians would quote reports, battle summaries, tactical outcomes, but that notebook would never make it into the archives. It remained a private relic of war, the weight of survival written in quiet ink, the code. Talkers went on to Bougainville, to Peleliu. to Iwo Jima, their voices echoing through the Pacific like unseen beacons. But Guadalcanal was the first time the world learned what their language could do. The cost was a single man's breath. The reward, an island saved, a battle turned, a future rewritten. And when the night finally stilled and the jungle fell silent once more, Begay pressed the transmitter one last time before dawn and whispered in Navajo banali, "Your words still fly." Static replied, faint, almost tender. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the sound carried on. When the battle finally ended, Guadalcanal looked less like victory and more like the aftermath of something ancient, a place where the jungle itself had swallowed the war. The beaches were scarred with wreckage, the trees stripped bare by shellfire. The air reeked of oil, damp earth, and silence. The Marines who had survived moved like shadows through the mist, their faces hollow, their boots sinking into the same mud that had once hidden the enemy. The code talkers stayed behind, repairing radios that had melted in the rain, salvaging spare parts from crates marked U.S. Signal Corps. Copper wire was stripped, dried, and reused. Every piece mattered. In the field log of the 1st Marine Division, one entry read, "Signal efficiency improved by 87% following deployment of Navajo personnel. Message delay near zero." It was a sterile statistic, but for those who had been there, each percentage point meant lives. Across the island, command officers tallied what had been won and what had been lost. Nearly 700 men, American and Japanese, had died on Guadalcanal. Over 30 ships were sunk and 600 aircraft destroyed. But the line held. The airfield stood. The enemy retreat was real. For the first time, the Allies had proven they could stop the Imperial Army's advance, not with superior numbers, but with adaptation, timing, and faith in something unexpected. The code. Talkers were not decorated then. Their work was classified. Their reports were sealed. The official communiques credited communication improvements and efficiency in transmission. But among the men who had fought beside them, the truth was clear. Every soldier remembered the sound of the code, that calm, measured voice in the static that never faltered even when the guns were inches away. Leadership came not from rank, but from steadiness. A lieutenant later wrote, "The best command I ever gave was to tell them to keep speaking." He called it luck. The code talkers called it duty. Yet between the two was something neither could explain: the quiet precision that only comes when skill becomes instinct, when fear becomes focus. After the fighting ended, the island had to be rebuilt. Airstrips, regraded radio towers, re-erected fuel stores, refilled. The first ships of the next campaign were already forming offshore. Guadalcanal was no longer the end of the map, it was the beginning. The code talkers packed their radios and notebooks and boarded transport ships under gray skies, their boots still caked with island mud. No parade, no ceremony, only a new set of orders and another set of coordinates. In the ship's hold, Begay opened his battered field notebook and added one final line beneath Benali's last entry: "Message delivered. Line held. Mission complete." Then he closed it and placed it inside his pack, alongside the small copper wire he'd carried since that night, twisted, burned, but unbroken. On the mainland, the reports moved quietly up the chain of command. Signal officers noted code transmission unparalleled in efficiency. Cryptography analysts admitted off record that no known cipher system could have matched the speed or security of the Navajo code. Still, the mission stayed secret. The language itself remained classified until 1968. For decades, the men who had carried it said nothing. In later years, when asked how they did it, one code talker simply replied, "We remembered who we were." That was the essence of it. The paradox that a people once told to forget their language had used it to defend the very nation that silenced them. Luck had played its part, the weather, the tides, the timing of supply ships. But skill and discipline had made luck matter. The leadership lessons that came from Guadalcanal weren't written in manuals. They were carried in memory. Trust the human voice, build systems that breathe, and never underestimate what the world chooses not to understand. When historians later debated why Guadalcanal mattered, why this muddy, mosquito-filled island had shifted the Pacific War, the answer wasn't in the tonnage of bombs or the number of ships. It was in the sound of communication, fast, clear, unbreakable. And if there is a single line to resolve it, It's this, Guadalcanal proved that victory in war depends not on how loudly you speak, but on who still dares to speak when the world goes silent. When the guns finally fell silent, the code talkers came home quietly. No medals waited at the docks, no bands played their names. They blended back into the reservations of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, carrying scars the world couldn't see and secrets they were forbidden to tell. Their mission remained classified, their code locked away in vaults under the Department of Defense. To their families, they were simply Marines who had gone to war and come home changed. For 26 years, their story stayed buried. While the world celebrated Midway Normandy and Hiroshima, no mention was made of the Navajo voices that carried the Pacific campaign. It wasn't until 1968, when the Pentagon finally declassified the files, that the truth emerged, that the unbreakable code had not been built by machines or mathematicians, but by memory heritage and the sound of a language once outlawed in American classrooms. The revelation rippled through history like a belated echo. Military academies studied the Navajo code as a case study in organic encryption. Linguists marveled at its complexity. Syntax without alphabet nuance, without written form, a system so intricate that even fluent speakers outside the circle could not decode it. Communications officers began to talk about human-based redundancy, a lesson from Guadalcanal that shaped Cold War doctrine: train the messenger, not just the machine. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan declared August 14th National Navajo Code Talkers Day, calling their service an exceptional contribution to victory. By then, only a few dozen of the original 400 code talkers were still alive. Many attended the ceremony in silence, proud but reserved. They weren't men of spectacle. They were men of duty. One veteran was asked how it felt to finally be recognized. He answered simply, "We never needed medals. We just needed to be heard." Over time, the code talkers became symbols of something larger than war, resilience, cultural survival, and the reclamation of identity. Their story bridged two Americas, the one that had tried to erase them, and the one that finally listened. Schools that once punished Navajo children for speaking their language began teaching it again. Young students learned that the same words once whispered in foxholes had saved thousands of lives. The U.S. military, too, carried their legacy forward. Modern encryption systems, digital quantum, and voice-encoded all trace philosophical roots back to that principle from Guadalcanal: the best code is one that lives, one that breathes. The code talkers reminded the world that human ingenuity still outpaces machinery when guided by discipline and trust. But perhaps their most enduring impact lies beyond strategy or doctrine. The Navajo code wasn't just a weapon, it was proof that culture itself can be strength. In a century that often measured power in steel and fire, the Navajo proved that survival could sound like language, like prayer, like belonging. They turned words once used in ceremony into tools of defense, and in doing so, they rewrote what it meant to serve a country that had not always served them. Today, monuments rise across the Southwest, bronze figures holding radios instead of rifles, their faces lifted toward invisible signals in the sky. At the Navajo Nation Museum in Window Rock, Arizona, visitors can stand before the names of all who served. Many of those names have no headstones, no family lines left, only their voices preserved in brittle recordings humming faintly through static. As generations pass, their lesson remains. Communication is not just about words, it's about trust. Leadership is not command, it's the courage to listen. And history, when finally told, is never just noise, it's the signal that guides us home. So when we speak of Guadalcanal, of the Pacific, of the code that no enemy ever cracked, remember that it began with silence and ended with a voice that refused to die. Subscribe for archival-based stories, evidence over sensationalism. Because history doesn't whisper to those who chase headlines. It speaks softly, clearly to those who still choose to listen.